What's up, Barefoot Nation? This week we are delving into plant combinations. Now, I am not talking about designing specific plants yet and textures and all that. This is sort of the groundwork before I can talk about that in this design series. Without further ado, let's go! Alright guys, so what are we talking about when I'm talking about plant combinations? Well, this is actually a big part of the science and art of landscape design. And what you see here, this is for all intents and purposes a full sun plant combination. Now, where you live matters. And I'm here in Western New York, so although this looks very tropical, and a lot of these plants have actually been in the ground for 2 or 3 years. Like this ginger lily here, this was planted back in 2022. Although this is traditionally listed as hardy to zone 7 or 8, here in zone 6 it can actually be a perennial because this plant here is in a microclimate. And what is a microclimate? Well, as you can see, this part of the house absolutely bakes in sun all day long, and it also faces due south. Another thing is, it is right up against the foundation. Before I get too deep into the microclimate stuff, because that's a little more advanced, so the first thing I want to go into is, what would you consider full sun? So the horticultural definition of full sun is 6 or more hours of direct hot sun every day. And so 6 or more hours of direct sun every day actually is not that much sun. And this garden here actually gets a lot more sun than 6 hours of direct sun. And one of the ways that you can test that is when you look up at the sky, all you see, and especially today, is a beautiful blue sky. As you saw, there is nothing but open sky and it faces due south. So these plants get full sun. If you guys could do me a quick favor, over 95% of my viewers who watch this channel are not subscribed. If you guys could do me a quick favor, hit that subscribe button, it's free. I would greatly appreciate it, and it helps the channel. It tells YouTube all the stuff that they need to hear. All right, back to the video. And so, my fellow Americans, so these Blatilla orchids are actually a great example of a plant that needs sort of varying sunlight levels. Currently here in, as I was saying, it's June 22nd as of filming. These orchids can actually tolerate being in full sun because they're flowering now. But as these hardy orchids come out of flowering, they're gonna actually wanna have more shade. And the way that they're gonna get that shade is through a whole bunch of tropical focal point plants that will be more in their glory after the orchids are done flowering. So this right here is a needle palm. This is actually, once established, fully hardy into zone 6. As it continues to get warmer and warmer, this needle palm here is going to continue to put out bigger and taller fronds, and it's actually an evergreen. So over time, as this regrows, because the mother plant died back and blah blah blah, go see the needle palm video, it's going to cast a shadow behind it. And really there's kind of a whole menagerie of tropicals and canopy plants that will then create the level of canopy that I want. Is that the amount of shade that you want to cast is something that is important. You might not want to cast shade from a maple tree because maples tend to have pretty dense canopies. And when I was designing this garden, I wanted to, kind of a phrase that I kept in my head was, I want to cast my shade with a scalpel rather than a machete. Because, and what I meant by that is, like this area here, I want to maintain as full sun, because Crocosmia and Japanese iris, all the native iris, there's a whole bunch of full sun loving plants. And if they don't get it, they're gonna kind of languish. This sort of stretch here is a stretch that, regardless of how wooded or shaded or jungly the garden gets, is always gonna have full sun because of what's planted here. And even in my choice of tropicals, because if you guys have watched the channel at all, you know that I like tropical plants. This is a hardy banana that doesn't grow quite as tall as Musabastu or some of the other ones. This is Musella lasiocarpa. And so on the note of full sun, there's another thing that when I was in school I learned about clematis. The vine clematis likes to have its foliage and its flowers in full sun, but it also wants to have cool, shaded roots. Now, that might seem contradictory, but actually when you think about it, it's pretty easy. If you imagine being barefoot on this stone path on a day like today, it's about 86. It's pretty hot. Shifting back over to the iris area, that all of these plants have their canopy in full sun. So in other words, their canopy in this case is their leaves. This is a panicum grass, but these have all of their canopies in full sun. But if you look at the soil, because of the density that I've planted them at and how much they've spread over the years, there's probably a solid 5 to 10 degree difference in the temp here between the stone path and putting your foot in there. But save all your creepy barefoot comments for Garantham's channel. This ain't it. And just because you have a plant here like this calla lily that prefers cooler temperatures, it hasn't, but it's still subtropical. It doesn't really, or it's technically more of a cool temperate plant. But regardless of nomenclature, this plant here, you can kind of assume that the clematis approach would apply because their flowers and their foliage want to have full sun, but they don't, because they like a lot of water. And of course, water temperature is pretty consistent, whether it's water in full sun or it's in the shade, it's always going to be, it warms up very slow and it cools down slowly too. Another super important component to planting and design is what you could call the Three Sisters approach. Although I'm not talking literally about corn, squash, and beans in this application, I am talking about with the companions or the combination planting. So this pussy willow here is a beautiful native ornamental, and it is casting a shadow so that underneath it, it has creates the perfect conditions for this hardy ginger, this Zingiber myoga. And also for the ferns that are directly under the base of the tree. And now if you look at those ferns, you can see that they're clearly in the shade. If you go a foot over beyond the canopy where the sun sort of comes in at that angle, you can see that it's full sun. On the note of casting shadows and microclimates, now would be, I think, a great time to talk about microclimates. Now, I had sort of touched on it in the beginning, mentioning warm, sunny microclimates, but the inverse is also true. So here you can see this popcorn viburnum, and this plant is an absolutely gorgeous, full sun loving shrub, and it grows quite large. So one of the things that I'm doing in this garden, so at the base, if you look carefully, you can see that there is a ligularia, which is a shade perennial. And again, probably 2 feet out this way, it would be in full sun and very unhappy. But because the ligularia is planted not right at the base of the viburnum, but within the shadow of the viburnum, this plant is going to be happy because it's in that microclimate that it needs. And the other thing too to mention about microclimates is that the shady microclimates, the north side of plants and buildings, tend to be, of course, cooler, but they also tend to be a little bit more moisture retentive. So here's an example of a sort of hot and sunny microclimate. For this hot, sunny microclimate, what I've decided to do here, and this is probably a solid little zone 7 microclimate because these Blatilla ochracea hardy orchids come back for me every year. And I absolutely love this orchid. I actually might like these a little better than striata. I don't know, hard to say. I love them all. But, so you can see at the front of the garden, I've used annuals, these begonias. And so these wax begonias are great to sort of draw the eye in, give a little bit of color. And you can see that there's different grassy plants at the back. So right here in the center is actually a type of agapanthus or lily of the Nile. And so that's going to be flowering probably as the orchid is finishing. Then you can see there's a variegated liriope and there's also green leaf liriope all at the very back of the foundation. And their roots are fully in the shade. And that variety is called Super Blue, which is a little bit less cold hardy than Big Blue and some of the other ones. And so Super Blue is then going to flower in August, sort of like a purple, lavendery purple flower. There's also some remnants of a sedum tile carpet thingy that you know, I separated those pieces out, and you can see that they're just thriving right on top of the concrete, but obviously rooted in soil. The little viola is still actually looking really good, so that's always nice. And then you can see there's also another type of sedum here that is going to spread and sort of fill in this whole area. Sedum angelina is one of my favorites. I have mondo grass tucked into the shade, and but it still sort of is warm off of the concrete. And then my long-term focal point here for this garden is this young Sable Minor McCurtain. So this is a beautiful evergreen palm that is also zone 6 hardy once established. With these palms, it's always better to, just like I was saying earlier, it's always better to have a more mature specimen before you plant it. So like when you get these from seed or from like Plant Delights Nursery, you know, they come in the little cups. It's better to grow them on, plant them into a 3 or a 5 gallon container, let those roots grow. I know it looks ridiculous at first to plant, you know, their little seedlings in a container like that, but trust me, it works. And this palm, believe it or not, is going to grow and really fill in the space. And it'll be interesting to see sort of how the orchid and the palm sort of coexist with each other over time. I tend to think that it's going to be just absolutely stunning. And then of course now what is totally invisible are all of the bulbs like crocus and hyacinth. Actually you can see that this hyacinth is actually still hanging on a little bit, but in the spring this little pocket garden is totally full of daffodils and crocus and all of those lovely plants. Don't forget guys, these combos are all very applicable to container gardening as well. In fact, probably even more so. So what you'll notice here is I have a dedicated, and it might look a little bit off because the liriope is in the very front, but liriope is a very adaptable plant. But this here you can see is a succulent container. I have some aloe vera in the very center with basil. That is kind of a Mediterranean plant, even though we don't usually think of it that way. I also have a young little mangave here too, which is a great pairing with the aloe. So what you don't want to do generally is have something like these impatiens planted in near your succulents, because impatiens are very thirsty plants. They will take literally as much water. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're able to grow in water features, so you know their roots have oxygen, but impatiens can drink a lot of water given the right circumstances, so you would not want to put them in with your succulents. A better example of a flower for a succulent container would be portulaca. And begonias are kind of in that sweet spot of they can take slightly more moist conditions, not wet, not like an impatient, but they can take more moist conditions. So like this container is actually really interesting because all these flowers are planted at the base of a pygmy date palm, which is a pretty variable palm as far as water usage. So they can be very drought tolerant, but also during the summer in active growth, they can also take a lot of water. So it's sort of like a little bit of, so in cases like this, you get a sort of a nice creative mix of, you can see the begonias, and then for the summer, the impatiens. So because during the summer, I'm gonna keep this palm relatively moist, the impatiens are gonna do well, and they're also in the shadow of the palm itself, and the begonias are catching some sun later in the afternoon. Here's another couple examples of some combinations. Now, this is a Mandela's Gold yellow bird of paradise, but this plant, I didn't acclimate it at all to the sun in the spring, so you can see that the new growth is just fine, but this is all the growth that it had in the house, and it's green in the center, but you know, where the sun hit it, it is not happy. But regardless of that, I have some pineapple sage, just a type of salvia, planted in with these guys here, and you can see the begonias at the front. Another example of a couple different combinations here. This is my jungle area, or my forest, my wildlife corridor, whatever you want to call it. This area I am letting basically go fully to nature. Although it's a planted area, I'm letting nature more or less do what she wants. So it's like that, but it's also kind of a food forest. So this tree here is called a pawpaw. It's actually the only native and or cold hardy fruit tree related to, like, I believe custard apples. You can drop it in the comments if you know what or who they're related to. But this is a really interesting cold hardy tropical tasting fruit that is a woodland tree. And so when it was first planted, there was none of this. Well, the tulip tree was there, but it didn't help it to actually shade this. So none of these other plants were here making this woodland, where you can see, if we get close to the leaves, that it's in this really nice dappled light in the afternoon. But it gets direct hot sun first thing in the morning, probably for about 5 hours. When I first planted it, it was really struggling, not to mention the soil. I don't think I've talked about soil yet. So quickly on the note of soil, one of the best things you can do is put down quality mulch in your garden. Now, all mulches are not created equal. If you're buying mulch at the gas station or at Home Depot, chances are really good that you're not getting a quality mulch. Basically, this stuff here is called triple shredded hardwood, and you can see and smell that. So this mulch here, you can see it's a really fine organic mulch that actually will feed your soil. And even on a day like today where it's 86, you can see that I'm trying to smell their weeds and it's not working. So you can see that it's moist down in there, and even though it's sort of dry on the top. And so putting down mulch, a good mulch every year, is super, super important, because the goal with mulch is not just for it to look nice, but you actually are trying to feed your soil, retain water, and in some cases retain heat, or keep, sort of modify soil temperature. One of the things you don't want to do is, I just noticed on this tiny little inkberry here, which I planted last year, is that it's volcano mulched. Volcano mulching on woody plants will be a nice slow death for that plant. Well, it's horrible. I don't know how well you guys can see this because my screen is pretty sun-baked right now, but this wood is more moist than up here. And basically what happens is when a woody plant like a tree or a shrub is volcano mulched, it slowly just rots it away. So the part of the tree and shrub that need to be exposed is called the root flare, the collar, the crown, whatever word you use. The root flare has to be exposed, otherwise the plant will slowly suffocate. But back to the soil, this is a sample of what my soil used to look like. In it, that actually probably has more organic matter in it than it did when I moved in, but it was just horrible clay and rock and just garbage. And just slowly but surely, through the course of every fall, putting down a thick layer of shredded leaves, which then of course brings back all the ecosystem. And so we don't always have to think of mulch as that stuff that we buy in a bag or have dumped on our driveway. This is a perfect example of a mulch producing tree. This is a E.H. Wilson hardy mimosa. And so this tree here is what's considered a nitrogen fixer. So what this tree does is it has a special relationship with bacteria and fungi. I mean, every plant, every living thing is really interconnected, but these trees have a special ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil via these bacteria and fungi. And then of course the mycorrhiza make it available to everything. And so then the way that you make that mulch available to your plants is you actually would prune these plants usually in either late fall or early spring. Anything that you cut, then put at the base of a plant like a hardy banana, or anything that you wanted to fertilize with that plant's biomass. Another thing I kind of touched on with the potted plants that I want to emphasize here is you don't want to have plants that, like bananas, that need a lot of water sitting next to something that doesn't need a lot of water. So in this vignette here, you can see I have hardy bananas, hardy elephant ears, and then a menagerie of gorgeous Japanese irises, all of which they like to have a lot of water. So a great example of plants that need drier conditions being paired together would be this peach tree, which is actually in a raised bed. You can't really see it because I don't like pulling weeds, but so I'm not going to show you those. But what I have going on here is this peach tree is planted in a raised bed with various different types of herbs and mint that needs to be contained, the mint. And what that's going to do for me is it's going to give the peach what it needs, and also the herbs work together with the peach tree so that it moderates the amount of water that it gets. But, you know, it's really important that the peach does get that sort of drying out between waterings. All right, guys, I hope you learned something, and now hopefully you have a couple more concepts to use. Now, some of you guys are pros, but, I mean, the day that you're done learning is the day that you stop growing. So, no pun intended, we're talking about horticulture. So, yeah, drop a comment down below. What was your favorite tidbit? What did I miss? Did I miss anything? If you liked the video, be sure to drop me a big old thumbs up. It does make a difference in the channel. And of course, drop a comment down below. I think I said that already, but if I did, I'm leaving it in. All right, y'all. See you on the next one. Peace. That was not a peace sign.